All right, last week we were in our study of anti-Semitism and Christianity, looking at the subtopic of anti-Judaism, which is not to be confused with anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is based upon race, hatred of a group, or in this case, the Jews, based upon their race. Anti-Judaism would be a opposition, I wouldn't say hatred, it would be more opposition toward the Jewish religion, Judaism specifically. And there is a distinction. However, often one leads to the other, and sometimes it's hard to untwist them because they're so wrapped around each other. Christadelphians would be an example of a group that would be anti-Judaism. We're opposed to the Jewish religion because we believe it does not lead to life eternal. But we're not anti-Semitic. We don't hate the Jewish people at all. So that was important to make those distinctions. We then looked at allegorical women in church history portrayed through art, specifically these two women here, not these actual statues, because these representations you can find repeatedly in Middle Age Christian art, architecture. This is just one of many examples of the allegorical women, one representing the church. She's known as ecclesia, she's over on the left, and synagoga on the right, which represents Judaism. And you can see, for those who have not been with us, there's quite a distinct difference as far as their poses. Ecclesia is looking very confident. She's got a goblet in her hand. She's got an upright staff. She's got a crown on her head. She looks confident, looking straight ahead, whereas synagoga, she looks ashamed. She's got a blindfold over her eyes. The staff or spear she has in her hand is broken, and in her left hand, she's got tablets, but she's trying to hide behind herself, and this is supposed to represent Judaism. So it's kind of a theological statement that's being made through art. And it also shows up not only in architecture, but on the illuminated page. Here we have an early example. It's not as clear and obvious, but synagoga is circled, and she's got her blindfold on. She's hiding something behind her back. And this one's a little bit different in that she's got a animal head in her hand. And we were talking about it looks like a goat, but from what I can find, it's actually a ram, which represents the sacrificial system, which, of course, Judaism was based upon. So this is another example of portrayal of at least the Jewish faith in a negative light. That was Strasbourg Cathedral, but you can also find it in various places in France. I know there's Notre Dame Cathedral. The week before I actually listed some of them and showed them on the map. I'm just kind of quickly zapping through, but I remember that was Strasbourg Cathedral in Strasbourg, France, which is right on the border with Germany. So here's a little zoomed in version. What do I have highlighted there? I can't even make it out myself. Yeah, the ram is right there. Oh, that's okay. That's a crown. That's a crown being toppled off of her head. That's often a symbol that you will find associated with synagoga. There's the ram. So here is another version of synagoga and ecclesia, but this is in the context of the 5 foolish and 5 wise virgins. The 5 wise virgins are on the top with their torches lit. the five foolish virgins on the bottom have their torches unlit, which they look like they're ringing bells, but they're upside down torches. But what's interesting is how the groups are led by, what do you know, it looks like portrayal of synagogue and ecclesia. There's nothing about crowns or cups or banners in the parable of the 10 virgins, but here we have the leader of the foolish virgins with a blindfold, the crown is fallen off her head, and she's also hiding something behind her back. So you see this, these symbols being used in different places, different contexts. Here we have the parable of the 10 virgins. All right, so there's a little bit better view. And this is a more modern, this was a 19th century cathedral. And I'm trying to remember, I think this is, no, this is not yet. I had my notes set up for the new context. All right, this is a Basilica of Notre Dame. Many of these cathedrals are Notre Dame, Our Lady. This is in Marienthal, France. And this was a 19th century, fairly recent, so it's not just a medieval motif. Here we have ecclesia on the left, capturing the blood and water coming from Jesus' side. And we have a synagogue with a broken staff. Again, she's blindfolded, holding tablets as if she's ashamed of what's on them. So this is a way that you could portray theological points. In this case, Christianity is superior than Judaism. And again, this is a common motif in mainstream Christianity in their architecture. So then I can't remember, I took you here to Germany, a parish church in St. John's Church in Werben. And here we have, yeah, I did, because I remember the four-headed creature here, that this is actually ecclesia. She's got her crown, she's got her goblet, she's got her staff, and she's looking very royal. Over here we have synagogue sitting on a donkey. Here we got our ram's head. She's got her knocked off crown. One extra element is this dagger coming out of the clouds, representing God's wrath on the synagogue or on the Jewish people or their Jewish faith. It's a four-headed beast. So it was often, if you ever go back to the early manuscripts back when they were illuminating the Gospels, each Gospel writer was often assigned a particular symbol. And I can't remember which was which. In fact, sometimes they were not even consistent. But you would have an eagle. I think the eagle represented John. Well, yeah, but if actually you go back and you look at all this, there is flipping. There's two Gospels where they kind of flip. Like the scribes couldn't make up their mind, or the priests or the theologians couldn't make up their mind. But there is usually consistency between, with John is always represented by the eagle. I guess it's because it's superior and higher up. But that's what that is. And it could very well also be derived where they came from. Came up with that idea is from the book of Ezekiel, where you had the cherubim with the four faces. But that is supposed to be a representative beast. The church is writing on the Gospels. So essentially the Gospels are what hold up the church. The good news about Jesus Christ. All right, so there's a better zoomed in picture of this. And this one here, I kind of, honestly, this sure looks like a goat to me. It looks kind of like a little beard on it. And I don't know, maybe rams have beards, but when I first saw this one, I thought it was a goat. And when I saw the other one, I assumed it was a goat, but when I read into that previous illustration, they say it was a ram. Nonetheless, it's supposed to represent the sacrificial system, whether it's a goat or whether it's a ram. All right, so let me see if I can get back on. That was all just covering where we've been. Okay, so one other thing I didn't, this was right toward the end. Now, the Strasbourg statues, the representations of synagogue and ecclesia, they were being installed just about the same time some terrible event was occurring in Europe. This happens to be Strasbourg Cathedral on the right. The terrible event was the Black Death, also known as the bubonic plague. And it was at its worst between 1346 and 1353. And it was just about the same time that this cathedral and also the Notre Dame Cathedral, which you had to have been here in the previous weeks to have seen, they were both being completed at that time. So put yourself in the shoes of someone in the Middle Ages living in Europe, facing the Black Death, which from what I find in my research, it's estimated that 50%, half of Europe's population perished, as many as 50 million people. So that's going on as these buildings are being constructed and as synagogue and ecclesia are being placed at the portal in one of these sides of the cathedral. And the plague created all kinds of upheavals, religious, social, economic, and had profound impact on the course of European history. And the Black Death was pretty horrible. Your skin would turn black, and 80% of the victims would die in the first 8 days. And the Black Death, here's kind of a portrayal, kind of gruesome. They're showing it kind of more like pox, lumps. And over on the right side, you see the people burying the victims of the Black Death. So, what was behind the Black Death? Well, as you go back and I guess there's a way to find this out, the Black Death has been blamed on the rat flea, this little guy up here. However, the people in the Middle Ages didn't know it was a rat flea. What they ended up doing was blaming it on, drum roll, the Jews. Why would you blame the Black Death on the Jews? Well, here's an article talking about the persecution that resulted. And if you look closely, I've highlighted Strasbourg. So at this very cathedral we've been looking at the artwork for, where we have ecclesia and synagogue, we have a massacre. Well, it says persecution of the Jews, but there was a blaming of the Jewish people for the Black Death in the city of Strasbourg at the time Strasbourg Cathedral was being finished and synagogue and ecclesia were being put in place. Could there be any relationship between the portrayal of synagogue and the resultant blame of the Jews for the Black Death? I don't know, but it surely doesn't help when you have this negative image of the Jews being portrayed on a house of God with the approval of the Catholic hierarchy. And here's I think it was over on the right-hand side is a tiny little thumbnail of an illustration. This is an illuminated manuscript where the people of Strasbourg are burning. You may not be able to make it out, but there's people in this fire, and there's not very happy things going on here. And why would anyone, these would be Jews, by the way, they're being burned if it's not obvious. Why would anyone blame the Jews for the Black Death? Well, it actually was a historical fact that the Jews did not die at the same rate as the rest of the population, which that probably doesn't help either. You think maybe the Jews have something going on, some kind of conspiracy going on. Maybe they have a pact with the supposed devil of mainstream Christianity. Anyway, the Jews got the blame rather than the little rat flea, which of course they were ignorant of. One thing that's interesting about Judaism, we ended on this note, Walter brought this out. It could also be why the Jews did not die at the same rate as everybody else, is because the Jews had a burial, well, actually still do to this very day. They have a custom that you're dead, they bury within 24 hours. That is the goal. If you were a Jew, the goal is to be buried, you will be buried within 24 hours. And this is kind of odd. I was thinking, like, where in the world did they come up with that idea? Believe it or not, it comes from the Bible, sort of, in a kind of a twisted way. This is an odd verse to point to, but if you talk to a rabbi, this is what they're going to point to as to why they want to bury their dead within 24 hours. This comes from Deuteronomy 21. And if a man has committed a crime punishable by death and he is put to death, you hang him on a tree. His body shall not remain all night upon the tree, but you shall bury him the same day. For a hanged man is accursed by God. You shall not defile your land, which the Lord your God gives you in inheritance. So what's the problem here? Well, the majority of Jews don't die by hanging. And yet this is the verse that rabbis will point to even to this very day to justify the custom of the Jews of burying their dead within 24 hours.
Just a couple things. Can you go back a slide?
What was that?
Can you go back a slide? Okay, so this is interesting because the French culture has always had rampant anti-Semitism. There were so many different persecutions against them, including during World War II. They were more anxious to get rid of the Jews than the Germans were. They packed them up and sent them across the border into Germany and Poland as fast as they could. And the Dreyfus Affair is another one from much earlier that is very interesting. But I was just curious if you've run across in your studies of this why the French are so virulent against the Jewish culture all through time. I don't know whether it's just because they're more successful in their culture or not.
Could it be that the French are more Catholic?
Right, okay. The other thing I was just going to bring out is the Jewish cleanliness laws also prevented them a lot of time from getting the diseases that the surrounding nations had, which is part of the reason. Yeah. But
if anyone remembers when COVID first broke out, people were trying to figure out where did it come from. And there was, within the Arab community, the Jews were actually being blamed for COVID. So this is not, a middle-aged phenomenon. I don't say we, but it's still not all that surprising that the Jews end up scapegoats for whatever thing goes bad. Walter?
Yeah, the other thing I forgot last week to mention is the Jews did not like to congregate with the Gentiles, we'll just call them. In fact, they would dig their own wells and not go to the public wells where everybody else went to get that degree of separation. And so they're not congregating with those people who are like really, really sick. And as you pointed, when one of them got sick and died, they quickly took care of the problem.
Right. I mean, there would be multiple reasons to explain why the Jews did not die at the same rate as non-Jews. They were also often set apart in ghettos or for themselves. Again, an isolation issue. And if you have a contagious disease and you have a group that's maybe say more hygienic or have different burial custom, which helps avoid this particular spreading of the disease, well, all this helps. It contributes to their longevity or their ability to withstand plagues like this. However, we have 20/20 hindsight. We can look back and say, how foolish they were to blame the Jews, but they blamed the Jews. And not only did they blame them, they ended up burning them off. And what's going on here. Yeah, it's rather funky. All right, getting a sneak peek. All right, so there's a bit of delay sometimes when all right. So this is in Strasbourg. That Wikipedia clip here has Strasbourg up there. So the question was, could all, the portrayal of synagogue in such a negative light, and also I'm trying to remember, I think it was the Foolish Virgins. That was actually in a songbook from Strasbourg. This comes from a songbook, a hymnal from Strasbourg. So, the people from Strasbourg surely didn't have a very good view of the Jewish people. And then you have the Black Death, and you have reason to suspect that the Jews may have, made a pact with the quote-unquote devil, and hence you need to eliminate them. And you end up setting them on fire. But if you go back to this, Strasbourg wasn't the only place. You have all these French, I think they're French names, Toulon, Barcelona, that's Spain, Erfurt, Basel, Frankfurt, Strasbourg. So it was not just isolated to Strasbourg. But again, these portrayals of the Jews in the negative light in synagogue, that's not isolated to Strasbourg. This was a motif that showed up throughout Europe. All right, let's see if we can get back on track. So that's where we left off. So this was a blow-up of synagogue in one of the cathedrals, and her blindfold here is a serpent. So what's the takeaway, and why am I showing all these images, statues, and stained glass windows and illuminated manuscripts? I think I started a couple weeks ago saying that art, of course, it's not only something you enjoy looking at, but art often is portraying a story or trying to tell you a story. Art sometimes can convey very powerful messages. And surely the serpent wrapped around a woman's head is trying to convey a powerful message. The bottom line, art can teach theology. And what all these images of ecclesia and synagogue do is they convey anti-Judaism, a prideful version of one's own faith against another faith. And let me ask you this question. So I've tried to make a distinction between anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism, and hopefully you haven't forgotten that distinction. The question would be, is one any less dangerous than the other? I mean, everything I've been showing you is really based upon theology. They're not being portrayed this way because they have dark skin or big noses. It's based upon their theology, which would be more anti-Judaism. And yet we're seeing how portrayal of another person's faith can lead to some very bad things. So this is why I said initially that anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism often are twisted and wrapped around themselves. They don't have to be, as in the case of the Christadelphians. But traditionally, historically, they were intertwined. If you find one, it was almost a guarantee you're going to find the other. There was no distinction between the two. But technically, there is a distinction that needs to be made.
Just a quick point, if I may. It's when you look at the history of the Jews, even right now we see it. You see it throughout history. One of the many undesirable human traits that we have is the desire to blame someone or something. So, like for example, the hurricanes always someone's fault, right? Katrina was Bush's fault. This hurricane is
You can blame the weather on the Republicans.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So there's always this tendency to place blame on something or a group of people the way God has orchestrated it is that his people have felt the brunt of that, but still overcome, right? They've still, survived throughout the centuries, even though they've been that scapegoat. And and he's given an eternal reason for Christians to have this quote unquote excuse to dislike the Jews.
Right.
So,
Yeah, actually, I made a mistake. It was the Democrats were supposed to be blamed for the weather. If anyone followed the news this past week. This time, okay. Yeah. Yeah, we won't go there. So you can see that art can lead to some very bad, hurtful, deadly consequences. And here's another example. This is not a game that's being played here. They don't have betting chips or coins on the table. Anyone know what the little round discs are here? We probably wouldn't know it because we're not Catholics, but those are what's called the host. And the host is what basically we would say the bread that we partake of during communion are. This is a 16th century painting. I actually think it's maybe in the Louvre in France. And what's going on here is a man's holding a dagger and he's stabbing these little discs. And see if I can get you a better picture. So these are the discs I'm talking about. These are the hosts. There are different styles. Catholics use these during communion, and they're the equivalent of the bread that we break and share. So here's an example of how it's used in the communion in a Catholic service. So the Roman Catholic Church has historically used round wafers, and they also believe that when you eat the communion wafer, you're literally eating the flesh of Jesus, which goes on to explain why this can be portrayed in such a negative light. It's not just someone trying to break a wafer into two parts with a knife. You actually have someone trying to stab the body of Jesus. And who might the somebody be, or somebodies? These are actually depicting Jews. Okay. And I'm not sure. What was that? Why was it painted in what context? Well, because you want to spread a story about what at least in this case, the Catholics or Christians thought was happening. This was a repeated charge against the Jews, and often something like this will be brought up, so you can then blame the Jews for the Black Plague or whatever may be happening, bad wells and bad drinking water. Walter?
And that matches a prevalent teaching that was taught to me when I was, before I became a Christadelphian in various churches. The great infuriation or anger that the Christians would have is they firmly believe that this was someone killing God. Because, being Trinitarian, this is one part of God. And so it outraged them, that they killed God, because we know it's total nonsense. But it's still in the sight that people think of him that way. And so these Jewish people didn't know who they had and what they had and what they did to God in that thing.
Right.
And then you get the extension into France. So that prevailed throughout France, with the Catholic Church, as you pointed out. But as modern times came, the population of France changed its density from mostly Catholic people to the Muslim people now. And so they have a distinct hatred of the Jewish people, because they didn't do the right thing with the birthright and so forth and so on. So you can see this trend that's building.
Yeah, it's interesting about France. So it's a good point you bring up. There's a term for this. It's called deicide. We didn't really talk about how the Trinity plays into the hatred of the Jews. We don't believe Jesus was the second person of the Holy Trinity, co-equal, co-eternal with the Father and the Holy Spirit. We believe he was a man, unique, second Adam, who obeyed God, and God rewarded, and God's Spirit was upon him. However, if you believe Jesus is God, then what you're doing there is you're killing God, or at least you're kind of like reenacting the crucifixion. Again, we're back to the question, who killed the Jews? I asked this question kind of very early on. Who killed Jesus? And often the Jews are the ones that are described as the ones killing Jesus. If Jesus is God, then the Jews killed God. And the term for that is deicide. We have homicide, if you kill a man. Deicide is if you kill God. This all gets back into the Trinity. And if you have that particular mindset, well then, this would be one way you could portray how the Jews killed God. But this also comes into play another way. Martha?
I just wanted to back up on cathedrals a little bit, to realize that back then, most people could not read and write, and therefore the cathedrals were depicting the Bible, and so you could go through the whole thing. I listened to a lecture on the Chartres Cathedral, and everything in there is a symbol of stories and theology, really.
Exactly.
So that's how the people learned at that point. Another thing to realize is that back then, art reflected life, whereas now life reflects art. But if you go to Sainte-Chapelle, which is a little cathedral right by Notre Dame, they tell the story of the Bible through the stained glass, and then all of a sudden it switches. The Jews are gone, and then it's the church for the rest of it, which we'll probably get to later. So it's really...
Yeah. So art is very powerful, even more powerful back then, when very few people had the skills to read. So this is, you can take this in a couple different ways, but this has a term, what's going on here. It's called host desecration. In fact, there's a Wikipedia article on this if you're interested. But the article starts out, let's see, in this article one cannot only find the previous painting, which we saw, one also finds a very interesting, actually, no, I was supposed to stop and read the article. The article starts off by saying, host desecration is a form of sacrilege in Christian denominations that follow the doctrine of the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. In other words, the bread actually is the body of Jesus. It involves the mistreatment or malicious use of a consecrated host, the bread used in the Eucharistic service of the Divine Liturgy or Mass, also known by Protestants simply as communion bread. So there's a term for what you saw there on this painting. It's called host desecration. So there's another, here we go. This is it's a very interesting German woodcut from the 15th century. I think I found it on this Wikipedia page, and it caught my attention because, it actually looked like a newspaper cartoon section. And it used to be, years ago, kind of heavy into cartoons, only because I was an art major, and sometimes you can see some very serious art in a cartoon, even, it's hard to believe that. Anyway, it caught my eye, and I tried to zoom in and figure out what this was portraying. And what I'm going to need to do, because it's not all that clear, I'm going to show you each strip. And there's a story that's being told here. So, from left to right, what you see in the first frame, the communion hosts, that is the wafers, those little circular wafers, they're stolen. So you see a thief coming in, kind of like looking over his shoulder, over here, and they're the little hosts. And he's breaking into a church, and the hosts are stolen. In frame 2, the wafers are sold to the Jewish community. Like, who else would want to buy the hosts? No one but the Jews. So the thief sells the hosts to the Jews. In frame 3, all these little hosts are carried to a Jewish synagogue, and in the last frame, the Jews can be seen conducting a ritual in which they, of course, pierce the hosts with a knife. And if you actually look closely, there's supposed to be blood right there. There's blood dangling or coming off the side of the table, okay? Because it's the real presence of Jesus. If If you move to the second strip, so the guards come, of course, you have to report missing hosts. The guards try to investigate in frame 1. In frame 2, the Jews attempt to burn the wafers in an oven, I guess maybe trying to hide the crime. And the authorities arrive just in the nick of time, and they catch the Jews in the act. And if you look close enough, in the fire, there's little round discs, but there's also a little baby in the oven. And this also plays on another accusation that the Jews were often having to confront, and that is the kidnapping of Christian children and killing them during Passover. Supposedly the story is that Jews would kill the babies of Christians, take their blood and mix it in with their dough in their matzah. So when they're eating Passover, they'd be eating the blood of the babies. Okay? Along with poisoning wells, that's another common accusation against the Jews. But that may be what's going on, why the little baby is in the oven. If someone has a better idea, let me know. There was actually another term. So just as the stabbing of the host has a name, host desecration, the killing of babies and taking the blood is also, it has a term, it's called blood libel. Any case, frame 3, moving on, the Jews are rounded up by the authorities, and then in frame 4, some of the Jews are beheaded with the sword. And then moving on to the last row, well, the guilty Jews are tortured with red-hot pincers. In frame 2, the entire community is driven out of the town with their feet bound and held to fire. And in frame 3, the original person who stole the host is captured and he's punished. And in the last frame, you see the Christians kneeling and praying to God that everything worked out fine. So, surely this is not portraying the Jews in a very positive light. And I've said in the past that racism, bigotry, in particular anti-Semitism, hatred of a particular group, it doesn't come about just because someone has a big nose or they have different colored skin. Hatred toward a group usually comes about by repeating a story, some type of storyline, something that justifies your hatred toward that people. And clearly what you see here being depicted, whether it be on the illuminated page or in stained glass, as Martha said, it's going to generate stories. You're going to have something to share and explain why you hate the Jews. Because they're stealing our babies, they're poisoning our wells, they're stealing our communion wafers, they're killing Jesus all over again. You have a reason now to hate the Jews because these stories are being repeated and at the hand of the Catholic or Christian church at that time, which was basically all there was. This is how racism, in particular, anti-Semitism is spread. The result of a story or a narrative that you tell. So are we running out? Are we ending up, or we got another 5 minutes? Okay, Walter's shaking his head, so I guess I'm out of time. Excuse me? 10:20? Okay, sometimes I think it's 10:25, but. Okay. Any questions? All right, well, thank you for your attention. I guess we're going to pick up. So next week we have the gathering, so there's not going to be a Sunday school class here. The following Sunday, I'm not going to be here. I believe Jason has volunteered that, or I pushed him into teaching, filling in for me. So it probably will be the last week of October when we pick up on this study. So thank you again.